The photo was taken at 6:42 a.m., just as the sun began to spill over the rim of the Grand Canyon. It showed Ethan Harper standing closest to the edge, phone held high, his smile wide but tense, as if he already sensed something was wrong. Behind him, slightly out of focus, were the other two, Mason Reed laughing mid-sentence, and Luke Alvarez squinting against the wind, one hand shielding his eyes. The canyon yawned behind them, vast and indifferent. It was the last confirmed image of all three friends together. They had driven through the night from Flagstaff, fueled by gas station coffee and the reckless confidence of men who believed preparation could outsmart nature. The plan was simple: hike down, camp near the river, and climb back out in 3 days. No guide. No satellite phone. Just maps, packs, and trust. Ethan had been the careful one. He double-checked straps, retied knots, insisted on marking the trailhead on his phone. Mason teased him for it, calling him paranoid, though his laugh carried an edge. Luke said little, taking in the canyon with quiet awe, as if measuring himself against something ancient. Rangers later said the weather report warned of sudden drops in temperature after sunset. A cold front, fast-moving, unpredictable. None of the men mentioned it in their messages home. The last text, sent by Ethan minutes after the photo, read only, "Starting down now. See you soon." By mid-afternoon, shadows stretched longer than expected. The trail narrowed, rock walls closing in, wind funneling through the canyon with a low, hollow moan. Footprints pressed into dust, then vanished over stone. Somewhere below, unseen, animals watched and listened. When the sun finally slipped away, the temperature fell hard. Silence replaced the birds. Darkness came faster than planned. That night, something went wrong. What exactly happened after the photo would become a question asked for weeks, whispered by families, investigators, and strangers online. Because by the time the search began, the canyon would give back only fragments. And 2 of the 3 men would not come back at all. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sun rose over the canyon rim as if nothing had happened, as if 3 young men hadn't stepped beyond the railing the night before and vanished into one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. By the time hikers began filtering onto the South Kaibab Trail, the photo posted hours earlier was already circulating among friends, unanswered messages stacking beneath it like quiet alarms nobody could hear. The first concern came from silence. Phones that should have buzzed with sunrise photos stayed dark. A ranger noted their vehicle still parked where it shouldn't be. By noon, unease hardened into action. Names were exchanged. Descriptions repeated. 3 friends. 1 trail. No return. Search crews moved fast, trained eyes scanning dust, stone, and shadow. Boots followed the narrow ribbon of path downward, reading the ground like a language. Fresh prints appeared at first, overlapping steps, uneven spacing, laughter frozen into the dirt. Then, without warning, they thinned. A scuffed edge near a switchback. A dragged heel. And then nothing. The trail didn't end. It simply stopped speaking. Rangers spread out, widening their grid. Radios crackled with updates that said very little. No dropped gear. No blood. No clear sign of a fall. Just absence. The canyon swallowed sound differently down there, wind bending through stone corridors, making every call echo back wrong. It felt like searching inside something alive. By the second day, helicopters traced slow circles overhead, their shadows sliding across cliffs like dark hands. Below, volunteers combed ravines where one misstep could mean a fatal slide. Still, nothing surfaced. The ground grew harder, older, unwilling to give up recent secrets. Even seasoned trackers admitted the same unsettling truth. It was as if the men had stepped off the map. Families arrived at the rim, eyes fixed on the vastness beyond the fence. They asked the same question in different words. How can 3 people just disappear? No one had an answer that felt real. The canyon offered only scale, a reminder of how small certainty becomes in places like this. On the 3rd evening, a ranger found something that almost didn't matter. A partial footprint pressed into softer soil near an unofficial offshoot, barely visible unless the light hit it right. It pointed away from the trail, toward a maze of rock and scrub few hikers ever chose. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to redirect hope. As night fell, Searchlights cut through darkness, illuminating cliffs that looked like walls closing in. Somewhere beyond them, the trail lay empty and indifferent. And wherever the three friends had gone after it stopped answering, something had already begun to change the rules of survival. By dawn, the canyon floor smelled of wet stone and cold pine. Rangers and volunteers moved slowly along the corridor where the trail should have continued, radios crackling with clipped updates that went nowhere. What unsettled them was not the silence, but the order in which it appeared, as if the land itself had decided to hide answers. The first prints were clear. 3 sets, pressed into damp sand beside a narrow bend, boots scuffed and uneven from the previous day's climb. They pointed south, then abruptly veered toward a shallow wash that was not on any map. A ranger knelt, tracing the heel marks with a gloved finger, whispering that people didn't just change their minds like that without reason. 10 yards later, the trail of feet fractured. One set drifted left, another right, and the third circled back in a nervous loop before stopping altogether. There were no drag marks, no signs of a fall, no blood. Just hesitation, captured in dirt. It was as if fear had been measured, weighed, and then abandoned. Search dogs arrived before noon, their handlers quiet and focused. The animals pulled hard at first, noses low, tails stiff with certainty. Then, almost together, they slowed. One dog sat down and whined, confused, staring into a stand of juniper as if something unseen blocked the path. The handler's voice broke when she radioed in the result. Scent lost. Nearby, a volunteer photographer documented everything, snapping images of the ground from multiple angles. Later, investigators would notice what he didn't at the time. Smaller impressions overlapping the boots, lighter, irregular, circling the area without direction. Paw prints. Coyotes, maybe. Or something larger. The animals had not chased. They had paced. As the afternoon stretched thin, the sun carved long shadows that turned rocks into crouched figures. One ranger swore he heard movement above them, a steady rhythm that wasn't wind. When he looked up, nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched settled heavily across the group. They followed the strange path anyway, climbing over broken stone and through thorny brush that tore at sleeves and skin. The footprints reappeared briefly on a ledge, then vanished again, swallowed by slick rock. No evidence suggested a struggle, yet everything suggested urgency. Whoever had walked here had been in trouble, and soon. At the edge of a dry ravine, they found the last human sign, a snapped branch, fresh sap bleeding pale against the bark. Beyond it, only animal tracks continued, weaving calmly into the deeper canyon. The decision to turn back was made reluctantly, recorded with frustration and fear. Maps were spread across a tailgate under harsh lantern light, lines and elevations arguing with one another. Someone pointed out that storms had been predicted, that flash floods could erase tracks within hours. Another suggested a mine shaft, a hidden break in the earth that could swallow sound and scent alike. No one said the thought they shared, that the animals might not have been a threat. In the margins of the maps, notes accumulated, arrows and question marks multiplying, until the canyon looked less like terrain and more like a mind in distress. When the wind rose, it carried a distant howl that cut short the discussion. Radios went quiet. The search would widen at first light, they agreed, pushing deeper, faster, before whatever had intervened decided to finish its work. No one slept, counting minutes, listening, wondering who among them would find something first, or be found by something else. Fear settled like dust on their tongues, unspoken, unavoidable, and heavy with the promise of answers nobody wanted yet. That night, as coordinates were logged and photos uploaded, a ranger stared at the images of those impossible prints. He couldn't shake the sense that the friends hadn't simply been lost. They had been redirected, guided by something unseen, into a place the trail refused to follow. By late afternoon, the canyon swallowed sound and scale alike. What had felt like a clear trail an hour earlier dissolved into a maze of stone shelves, dry washes, and shadows that shifted with every passing cloud. Heat pressed down without mercy, yet time seemed to stretch and fold, minutes slipping away unnoticed. Evan felt it first, the strange sense that the canyon was not moving around them, but through them, quietly rearranging their decisions. They stopped talking, not because there was nothing to say, but because words no longer felt reliable. Each step demanded attention. Loose gravel, sudden drops, deceptive ledges. The walls rose higher, bending light into a dull amber haze. Sweat dried too fast to notice, leaving salt on skin and doubt in the mind. Evan checked his watch again. It had only been 20 minutes. It felt like hours. Mark lagged behind, favoring his left ankle. He brushed it off when Evan asked, forcing a grin that didn't last. "Just tired," he said, but his voice echoed oddly, delayed, as if the canyon itself was answering instead. Lena walked ahead, silent, scanning the rock faces with growing unease. She kept stopping, turning slowly in circles, as though expecting the landscape to blink and change. When they reached the narrow cut where the trail should have reappeared, it wasn't there. Just stone. No signs. No markers. Even the footprints they'd been following faded into hardened earth. Evan felt a cold pulse in his chest, sharp and sudden. He tried to retrace their steps, but the walls looked unfamiliar now, angles wrong, colors muted. The canyon had rewritten itself. They argued then, voices cracking, bouncing back distorted and too loud. Lena wanted to climb higher, back toward light. Mark insisted they should descend, follow the drainage, find water. Evan stood between them, heart pounding, unable to choose. The sun dipped behind the rim, and the temperature dropped with frightening speed. Shadows flooded the canyon floor like ink. Time fractured. Hunger arrived before it should have. Thirst burned early. Evan's thoughts slowed, looping back on themselves. He kept seeing the footprints again, those impossible turns, the sudden vanishing. Had they walked in circles? Or had something guided them off course? The question felt absurd, yet impossible to dismiss. As dusk settled, the canyon came alive with sound. Wind moaned through stone corridors. Rocks shifted somewhere above. Mark stumbled hard, pain finally breaking through his denial. His ankle swelled fast, purple and angry. Lena tore strips from her shirt to wrap it, hands shaking. No one spoke about nightfall, but they all felt it closing in. They found shallow shelter beneath an overhang just as darkness erased the last of the sky. The cold was immediate, biting through clothes soaked earlier with sweat. Evan pressed his back to the stone, listening to his own breathing, trying to measure time by it. Nothing worked. Minutes vanished. Fear expanded. Somewhere in the dark, far below, something moved. Not close enough to see, but close enough to hear, a low, steady rustle that didn't belong to wind. Evan held his breath. Lena's eyes met his, wide and questioning. Mark clenched his jaw, fighting pain and panic. The canyon did not answer them. It simply waited, patient and vast, as the night tightened its grip and the first true test of survival began. Night fell inside the canyon without ceremony. One moment the walls still held a trace of burnt orange light, the next they swallowed it whole. The air dropped sharply, stealing warmth from skin and breath alike. Somewhere below the rim, the last echoes of movement slowed, then fractured, then vanished into the stone. They had been calling each other's names for hours. Shouts bounced and returned warped, delayed, sometimes sounding closer, sometimes impossibly far. By the time darkness settled, the voices were thinner, stripped of confidence. Hunger pressed in quietly. Thirst screamed louder. Every sound seemed to promise danger or rescue, never both. The screaming began after full dark. It wasn't constant. It came in bursts, sharp and sudden, tearing through the canyon like flares. One voice cracked high with panic, another followed lower, strained, as if dragged from a deeper place. Each cry triggered movement from unseen animals, stones skittering, wings lifting, eyes opening in the dark. Between screams there was breathing. Fast, ragged, recorded only in memory because nothing else remained to prove it happened. Fingers scraped rock searching for holds that vanished under touch. Knees buckled on uneven ground slick with cold. Time no longer moved forward. It looped, folded, then broke apart entirely. At some point, one scream ended differently. It cut off mid-sound, not fading, not echoing away. Just gone. The canyon swallowed it like it had never existed. The remaining voices froze. No one spoke. No one called out. Silence arrived heavy and deliberate. Minutes stretched into hours. Wind threaded through the ravines, carrying unfamiliar smells, damp stone, musk, something living nearby. Shapes shifted at the edge of vision, never close enough to name. Fear settled deeper than exhaustion. Whatever had happened to the voice could happen again. When the screaming stopped completely, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like a decision had been made by something older than them. Somewhere above, the rim still existed, unreachable and unaware. Somewhere below, the canyon waited. As the night dragged on, one of them began moving without direction, guided only by instinct and the need to escape the silence. Behind him, nothing followed. Ahead, the darkness opened, and with it, the first signs that the canyon was no longer just a place, but an active participant in what came next. The canyon did not return him all at once. It gave him back in fragments, scattered across days that blurred together, until even his own name slipped away. When the screaming stopped, there was only breathing, shallow and stubborn, rising and falling in the dark. He lay beneath a low shelf of rock where the air stayed cooler, listening to the night move around him without ever touching him directly. Morning came without relief. Sunlight crept down the canyon walls but never reached his face. Hunger had become a distant ache, less sharp now, replaced by a strange floating calm. He counted nothing anymore. Not steps. Not hours. Not days. Time inside the canyon no longer moved forward. It folded back on itself, looping in ways his mind could not follow. He spoke sometimes, though no one answered. At first he called out the names of the others, each one breaking differently in his mouth. Later, the words turned into apologies, then into sounds that had no meaning at all. When he tried to remember how long it had been since he last drank, the question frightened him more than the answer ever could. Animals watched him. He sensed them before he saw them, shapes shifting at the edge of vision. The scrape of claws on stone. Once, when he woke from a dream he could not recall, a small gray fox stood a few feet away, head tilted, eyes alert but not afraid. It did not approach. It did not flee. It simply observed, then vanished without a sound. He should have been dead. He knew that in the same distant way he knew the sky was above him, even when he could not see it. His body had become lighter, bones pressing hard beneath skin, joints burning when he tried to move. Yet every night he slept, and every morning he woke again. Something inside him refused to let go. Rain came one evening without warning. He lifted his cracked lips and let the drops fall where they may. Water traced the grooves of his face, washed dust from his eyes, pooled briefly in his palms before spilling through trembling fingers. He laughed then, a broken sound, startling even himself. The canyon swallowed it instantly. Later, fever dreams took over. He wandered without moving, reliving moments that never happened. He saw campfires that were not there. He heard voices calling him by a name he no longer recognized. When he tried to answer, nothing came out. His tongue felt too heavy, as if it belonged to someone else. At some point, he stopped trying to leave. The canyon had become both prison and shelter, threat and protection. Moving meant pain. Staying meant survival. So he stayed. Curled beneath stone, guarded by shadows and passing eyes, held in a strange truce with the wild around him. Far above, search grids shifted. Helicopters passed overhead, their distant thunder never quite reaching him. He did not look up when the sound faded. He had learned not to hope. But the canyon, patient as ever, was already preparing to break the silence in a different way. They found him just after sunrise, when the canyon was still holding its breath. A volunteer tracker noticed movement near a cluster of scrub juniper far below a switchback no human trail should have led to. At first, he thought it was an animal. Something thin. Something crawling. Then the shape lifted its head, and the tracker froze. The boy did not wave. He did not shout. He only stared, eyes sunken and glassy, as if the act of being seen hurt. By the time rescuers reached him, his body was barely a body at all. Skin clung to bone. His lips were cracked beyond bleeding. His hair had been hacked short, uneven, as if torn away by hands that no longer cared about pain. When they tried to lift him, he whimpered once and curled inward, protecting his chest like a wounded animal. "What's your name?" one medic asked softly. The boy stared past him. "Can you hear me?" Silence. Then, after several seconds, a sound escaped his throat, raw, hoarse, almost forgotten. "I don't know." The words hit harder than the heat. They wrapped him in foil blankets, hooked fluids into his arm, and radioed the find. The canyon echoed with urgency, but the boy drifted in and out, eyes flickering at shadows no one else could see. Every loud noise made him flinch. Every human touch felt unfamiliar, dangerous. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly. Severe dehydration, advanced starvation, infected cuts on his legs and arms, bite marks, some old, some healing. When a nurse tried to clean his hands, she noticed dirt packed beneath his nails and faint scratches along his palms, as if he had been gripping rock or fur. The sheriff arrived with photos. 3 smiling faces at the canyon rim. "Do you recognize them?" he asked gently, sliding the picture closer. The boy's breathing changed. His fingers curled into the blanket. "I know the wind," he whispered. The room went still. "What about them?" the sheriff pressed. The boy shook his head, then stopped, pain flashing across his face. Tears filled his eyes, but none fell. "They stopped answering," he said. "After the night." No one pushed him further. News broke within hours. One of the 3 missing hikers had been found alive. Headlines called it a miracle. Commentators used words like impossible, unexplainable, divine. But the medical staff used different words. Survivor guilt, acute trauma, dissociation. That night, as rain swept across the canyon miles away, the boy woke screaming. He fought invisible hands. He begged something unseen to stay back. When the nurse calmed him, he whispered something that made her step away from the bed. "They didn't hurt me," he said. "Who?" she asked. "The ones with eyes in the dark." Search teams returned to the canyon the next morning with renewed urgency. If one survived, maybe others had too. Dogs picked up trails near the area where the boy had been found, but the paths twisted strangely, circling, doubling back, vanishing near steep drop-offs. And then there were the reports. Rangers spoke quietly of animal tracks surrounding the boy's location. Coyotes. Mountain lions. Too many. Too close. Yet no signs of attack. No drag marks. No feeding. It was as if something had stood guard. As night fell again, the boy lay awake in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. He could feel the canyon still watching him, patient and vast. Somewhere in that darkness, the answers waited. And for the first time since his rescue, he whispered a name. Not his own, but one of the missing. He woke to the sound of breathing that was not his own. It came from the darkness beyond the rocks, slow and steady, warm against the cold air of the canyon. For a moment he believed he was already dead, that this was some animal waiting patiently for him to stop moving. His fingers tightened around the stone he had slept with clutched to his chest. When his eyes adjusted, he saw the shape. Not a bear. Not a mountain lion. A coyote sat a few feet away, its narrow face tilted, ears forward, eyes reflecting faint starlight. It did not snarl. It did not advance. It simply watched, as if counting his breaths. The boy, because he had forgotten his own name by then, did not scream. He had learned days ago that screaming wasted strength. Instead, he stayed still, ribs aching with every inhale, throat raw from thirst. The coyote eventually turned its head toward the canyon floor and let out a short, sharp yip. Somewhere farther down, another answered. Then another. They never came closer. That was how it had been for days. Animals appeared at the edges of his failing vision and then withdrew, pacing him, shadowing him as he moved, circling the places where he collapsed. He expected teeth. He expected pain. What he received instead was distance. Face. Time. Once, when he crawled toward a trickle of muddy water, a raven landed ahead of him and cawed until he changed direction, leading him toward a shaded cleft where moisture still clung to stone. Another time, half delirious, He stumbled near a steep drop and heard a sudden explosion of wings as birds burst upward, startling him back onto solid ground. His mind could not make sense of it. Hunger twisted his thoughts into knots. He began to believe the canyon itself was alive, using animals as its hands. At night, he dreamed of his friends. Their faces appeared whole and smiling, then fractured into dust when he tried to speak to them. He woke with his mouth open, calling sounds that no longer formed names. The coyotes answered sometimes, their voices echoing up the rock walls, not close enough to touch him, never far enough to leave him alone. His body was failing. Skin hung loose over bone. His legs shook violently when he stood. He rationed movements the way other people ration food. Still, something kept him going. A pressure at his back, not a shove, but a presence. On the 12th or 13th day, time had dissolved into light and dark. He collapsed near a cluster of scrub. He was too weak to lift his head. He felt warm breath again, closer this time, and waited for the end. Instead, something brushed against his arm and then withdrew. A strip of dried meat lay inches from his hand, torn and filthy, dropped as if by accident. He cried then. Not loudly. Just enough for tears to sink into the dust beneath his cheek. When helicopters finally roared into the canyon days later, he did not run. He barely looked up. Rangers would later say animals scattered as the noise approached, melting back into the rocks as if they had never been there at all. As hands lifted him and voices spoke urgently above him, he turned his head once more toward the shadows. For a brief second, he thought he saw a pair of eyes watching calmly, satisfied. And somewhere deep inside, a question formed that would not let him rest. If he had been protected, what had happened to the others? No one asked the boy immediately. Not in the way people wanted to. When they lifted him into the helicopter, when the medic wrapped foil around his shaking body, when the canyon finally released him back into human hands, the questions stayed locked behind professional restraint. Names could wait. Answers could wait. Survival came first. But silence has weight. And as the helicopter pulled away from the canyon floor, the boy's eyes kept drifting toward the widening distance below, as if something down there was still holding him. At the field hospital near the rim, he lay beneath white lights that felt unreal after weeks of shadow and stone. For lines fed into his arm. His lips were cracked, his ribs sharp beneath thin skin. When a ranger gently asked if he remembered how long he'd been out there, he only shook his head once. Later, after water. After sleep that came in broken fragments. After the shaking eased. That was when he whispered the first name. Ethan. The sound barely carried across the room, but it landed like a dropped plate. A nurse leaned closer, careful not to startle him. "Who's Ethan?" she asked. The boy swallowed. His eyes filled, not with panic, but with something heavier. Guilt. He was right behind me, he said. Until he wasn't. Search coordinators gathered quietly outside the room. Maps were pulled back out. Timelines reopened. The canyon, which had begun to feel finished with them, suddenly felt alive again. When they returned to the boy, they asked carefully about the last day all three were together. He spoke slowly, as if stepping through memory the way one steps across loose rock. There had been an argument. Not loud. Tired voices. The trail had split into something unofficial, barely marked. One of them had wanted to turn back. One had wanted to push forward before dark. The canyon had not cared which they chose. He remembered losing sight of them near dusk. Remembered calling out until his throat burned. Remembered hearing something answer once that wasn't a voice at all. "Did you see what happened to them?" a ranger asked. The boy stared at the ceiling. "No," he said. Then, after a long pause, "I heard it." That was all he would say. Search teams went back down at first light. They followed the boy's broken account, the half-remembered turns, the places where fear had taken over navigation. They found a pack strap caught in brush. A torn map. A boot print that ended at bare rock. They did not find bodies. Not that day. Not the next. And slowly, the question everyone had been circling settled into something darker than hope or grief. The canyon had given one of them back. But it was still holding the other two. And no one yet understood why. The canyon did not give answers, it absorbed them. By the time the helicopters left and the tape was rolled away, silence reclaimed the rim. News vans packed up, leaving ruts in the dust, and the sun slid behind stone walls that looked unchanged by grief. For the families, the search did not end. It hardened into a waiting room without clocks, where hope and dread sat across from each other, refusing to speak. Rangers returned with maps marked in red and blue, each color meaning something unfinished. They explained exposure, flash floods, falls, the statistics that make tragedy orderly. None of it explained why only one came back. None of it explained the marks found high along a ledge where no human path existed, or the absence of scavenging on a body that should have been torn apart. The canyon listened, indifferent. The boy, still thin and trembling, was moved between hospitals and interviews. His voice came slowly, like water coaxed from stone. He remembered shadows pacing him at night, shapes that stayed close without closing in. He remembered warmth when the cold should have killed him, and a corridor through thorn and rock that never cut his skin. When asked about his friends, his gaze drifted to the window, as if following something only he could see. Search teams pushed deeper, lowering ropes into slots that smelled of damp iron. They found a pack shredded by weather, a boot wedged in a crack, and a journal page fused to mud. Names were written there, cramped and fading, ending mid-sentence. Farther down, they found nothing at all. No bones. No clothing. No trace. The canyon, vast and patient, had erased them. Official statements arrived, polished and careful. Presumed deceased. Cause undetermined. Case closed. But closures are for doors, not wounds. Families argued against the language, clinging to the possibility of movement, of shelter, of some hidden place that might still breathe. At night, they dreamt of footsteps echoing upward, answered by the wind. The boy asked to return once, months later, escorted and quiet. At the rim he stood with hands in his sleeves, staring down. He whispered a thank you that no one recorded. Rangers watched, uneasy, because animals avoided the place that day. Birds circled wide. Even the ravens kept their distance. When he turned away, a warmth lingered where he had stood, as if the stone itself had remembered him. Years passed. The story thinned into a headline, then a rumor. Hikers claimed they heard voices guiding them from danger, or felt watched in moments of fear. Others reported tracks beside their own that vanished at dawn. Officials dismissed it all, but rescue logs told quieter truths. Improbable survivals, bodies found untouched, lost people emerging with eyes full of night. The canyon keeps its dead, people say. It keeps other things too. It keeps bargains made without words, and guardians older than trails. On certain evenings, when the light drops straight down and the walls glow like embers, you can almost believe the stone is breathing. And if you stand long enough at the rim, listening past your pulse, you may hear a promise carried upward, thin and steady, that some are taken, some are returned, and the rest are never meant to be found. Investigators filed the last reports, yet doubts followed them home. One ranger admitted the canyon changes rules when it wants. Another said predators do not guard prey. The boy slept poorly, waking to the sound of breathing that was not his own. He survived, but survival is not an ending. It is an opening. Beyond the rim, questions waited, circling like wings in the dark, promising that the truth, whatever it was, had not finished speaking. The search would reopen in memory, if not on paper, pulling listeners forward toward what the canyon would demand next in the coming days. The canyon returned to its routines quickly, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. Tourists leaned over railings again, snapping photos where search helicopters once hovered. Rangers dismantled the last command tent, folding maps that still carried grease pencil circles around places no one would revisit. Only one thing remained out of place. The boy who survived never truly returned with them. After his discharge, he tried to speak. Doctors, investigators, and reporters all wanted answers. They asked about the animals, the nights, the missing days. He answered carefully, choosing words like stones across a river, never stepping too far. He said he remembered warmth when there should have been cold, shadows that moved but never closed in. When pressed, his voice thinned. Some things, he said, did not want to be named. He went home briefly. Old friends visited, bringing food, laughter, and forced normalcy. They talked about school, about jobs, about plans that assumed the future was solid again. At night, though, he sat awake, listening for wind that sounded like breath. He slept on the floor sometimes, saying the bed felt too soft, too exposed. Within months, he returned west alone. No cameras followed him this time. He told his family he needed to see the canyon once more, to finish something. A ranger remembered him standing quietly at the rim, thinner than before, eyes fixed on the vastness below. He did not hike down. He did not cross any barriers. He simply stood there until dusk, then walked away. That was the last confirmed sighting. His car was later found at a remote trailhead miles from the main park. Inside were his wallet, his phone, and a folded piece of paper with no writing. Search efforts resumed briefly, but they lacked urgency. There were no screams reported, no strange tracks, no animals circling. Just absence, clean and final. Some believe he chose the canyon. Others think the canyon chose him. Rangers speak quietly of certain places where radios fail and time bends, where animals behave like witnesses instead of predators. They say survival sometimes creates a debt, and nature always collects. Years later, visitors still pause at the overlook where three friends once smiled for a photo. The image circulates online, tagged with theories and arguments. But the truth lives elsewhere, deeper than evidence, older than memory. The canyon remains, patient and immense. It keeps its secrets the way it keeps its dead, without malice, without mercy. And somewhere within its layered silence, a boy who survived the impossible finally answered a call no one else could hear.